The first time I realized the forest could listen, I was standing alone at dusk with my radio dead in my hand, the pines leaning in so close that my own breathing felt like a confession. My name doesn't matter the way people think names matter, but I'll give you one because stories demand a spine to hang on. I was 37 that year, with just enough experience to believe I understood the land and just enough arrogance to think it would warn me before it ever turned. I was a ranger, federal, sworn, trained, stationed in a northern range where the trees grow tall and straight like old men refusing to bend, and the snow comes early and leaves late. Locals call it pine country, but that name is too gentle. Pines don't whisper the way people imagine. They hold their breath. They watch. I had been working that forest for over a decade. I knew the seasonal rhythms, the way the elk moved when storms rolled in from the west, the places where hikers twisted ankles, the creeks that looked shallow until they took you by the knees. I knew the old logging roads no longer marked on maps and the newer trails cut by social media optimism and poor boots. I knew the faces at the general store in the nearest town, families that had been there long before the park boundary lines were drawn, people who spoke about the woods with a respect that bordered on superstition. When they warned you, they didn't raise their voices. They just stopped smiling. My job was to protect the forest and the people who came into it, and to believe, truly believe, that preparation, procedure, and calm judgment could answer anything that went wrong. That belief is important. It's the first thing the woods took from me. That evening, I was responding to a routine call. A hiker overdue by a few hours, last seen heading toward a high ridge where the trail narrows and the wind scours sound into nothing. These cases almost always resolve the same way. Someone misjudges daylight, or chases a view too far, or panics when the trail fades under snow. You find them tired, embarrassed, grateful. You escort them back. So you tell them they were lucky. They promise to be smarter next time. The forest exhales, and you go home. I parked the truck at the trailhead as the light began to drain from the sky. The temperature had dropped fast, that sudden cold that feels like the forest closing a door. My radio crackled once, then fell silent. Dead zones aren't uncommon out there. I checked my spare battery, adjusted my pack, and started up the trail. At first, everything felt ordinary. My boots knew the ground. The air smelled of sap and old needles, a clean, resinous scent that usually settles my nerves. But there was something off in the way the woods held still. No wind, no birds calling in the canopy. Even the insects had gone quiet, as if someone had turned a dial I couldn't see. I told myself it was nothing. I'd worked too many hours to be spooked by silence. Still, I found myself counting my steps, listening harder than usual, the beam of my headlamp cutting a narrow tunnel through the darkening trees. That's when I noticed the footprints. They crossed the trail at an angle, deep impressions in the thin crust of snow, too deep for a deer, too wide for a bear. I knelt and ran a gloved hand along the edge of one print, feeling the packed ice where weight had pressed down hard. 5 toes. A long heel. Human-like, except no human I knew could have left marks like that without sinking to their knees. I stood up slowly, my eyes tracing the line where the tracks disappeared into the timber. I felt a prickle of embarrassment at my own reaction. There are explanations for everything, I told myself. Old snowshoes, a prank, a trick of light and shadow. The mind fills in gaps when it's tired. I kept moving. The higher I climbed, the more oppressive the quiet became. My headlamp picked up the reflective eyes of something small darting off the trail, and my heart jumped harder than it should have. I laughed under my breath, the sound thin and sharp in the cold. Get a grip, I thought. You're the calm one. You're the answer people call for when things go wrong. About a mile up, I found the hiker's pack. It sat just off the trail, propped against a stump, as if carefully placed. No signs of a fall, no blood, no drag marks. Just a pack, unzipped with a water bottle still half full and a map folded wrong, the way people do when they've stopped paying attention. I called out, my voice carrying farther than I expected in the stillness. No answer. I called again, louder, letting authority creep into my tone. The forest swallowed it whole. That was the first moment unease turned into something heavier. People don't leave packs unless something makes them. Panic, injury, or a sudden irrational decision that only makes sense in the instant it's made. I marked the location, took photos, and followed the faint scuffs leading away from the trail. The tracks led downhill toward a stand of old-growth pines so dense the moonlight couldn't reach the ground. As I stepped under the canopy, the air changed. It felt damp and cold, carrying a smell I didn't recognize at first, musky, almost sweet, like wet fur left too long in a closed space. I stopped, listened. There was a sound then, low and distant, more vibration than noise. It rolled through the trees and into my chest, setting my teeth on edge. Not a growl, not a howl. Something deeper, slower, as if the forest itself were clearing its throat. I should have turned back. Every instinct I had, honed by years of training and near misses, told me this was the point where caution mattered more than pride. But there was a missing person out there, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down harder than fear. I moved forward, one careful step at a time. The ground sloped toward a rocky outcrop riddled with narrow openings, old caves carved by water and time. Locals avoided them. They told stories about sounds that came from underground, about lights seen where no one should be. I had always chalked that up to isolation and imagination. As I approached the nearest opening, my headlamp caught on something pale against the rock. Fabric. A sleeve, torn and snagged on stone. I reached for it, then froze. From inside the cave came the sound again, closer now. A breath, drawn deep and slow, followed by the unmistakable crunch of stone shifting under weight. I stood there, caught between duty and a fear I didn't yet have words for, the forest pressing in around me as if waiting to see which way I would break. I don't remember deciding to step into that cave. I remember my body moving forward while my mind stayed behind, cataloging reasons this was a bad idea and filing them away for later, as if later was guaranteed. The opening was low, jagged rock scraping against my pack as I ducked inside. The beam of my headlamp skimmed across damp stone walls, catching veins of quartz that flashed and vanished like nervous thoughts. The sound stopped the moment I crossed the threshold. Silence inside a cave is different from silence in the forest. It isn't empty. It's compressed, heavy, like pressure behind the eyes. I called out again, my voice echoing back in broken pieces. No reply. The smell was stronger here, wet earth layered with that same musky sweetness. Animal, but not any animal I knew well enough to name without doubt. I told myself to stay methodical. That fear makes people sloppy. That caves distort sound and size and reason. I took another step back, then another, careful not to slip on the slick stone beneath my boots. The passage widened slightly, opening into a chamber where the ceiling arched overhead like the ribs of something enormous. My light swept the ground. That's where I saw the marks. Scratches gouged into the rock face, deep and uneven, running from waist height to well above my reach. Not claw marks, not quite. They looked torn, as if something had raked the stone in frustration or warning. Beneath them, pressed into the dirt, were more footprints. Bigger than before. The heels sunk deep, the toes splayed wide. I backed up a step without meaning to. That's when I heard movement behind me. I spun, light flaring against the cave wall, heart hammering hard enough to make my vision pulse. Nothing there. Just the narrow entrance I'd come through, a slice of darker black against the night outside. I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting the inhale, the exhale, grounding myself the way we're trained to do when panic threatens to take the wheel. You're alone, I told myself. The forest plays tricks. Your mind fills in gaps with old stories and half-remembered warnings. Find the hiker. Do your job. I edged deeper into the chamber. The cave sloped downward, the floor uneven with fallen stone. My headlamp picked up something ahead, a shape slumped against the far wall. For a moment, relief flooded me so hard my knees went weak. I hurried forward, boots skidding on loose gravel. It was the hiker, or what was left of him. He was alive. I could tell by the shallow rise and fall of his chest, the faint sound of breath catching in his throat. But his eyes were open, staring past me at nothing, pupils blown wide in the dim light. His clothes were torn, mud-streaked as if he'd been dragged. One arm was bent at an angle that made my stomach turn. I knelt beside him, speaking softly, the way you do when you're trying not to startle someone already on the edge. He didn't respond, didn't even blink. I reached for my radio again, tapping it uselessly, then switched to the emergency channel. Static. Dead. As I checked him for injuries, I noticed something else. His hands were clenched tight, knuckles white, nails torn and bloody. Whatever had happened to him, he'd fought. Not to get away, to get something off him. A low sound rolled through the chamber then, so close I felt it vibrate in my bones. The hiker's eyes flicked toward the darkness behind me, and for the first time he reacted. A thin whimper escaped his throat, raw and childlike. "Easy," I whispered, though my own voice shook. "You're safe. I've got you." The sound came again, closer, accompanied by the scrape of stone and the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I stood, placing myself between the hiker and the dark. My hand went to my sidearm, fingers brushing the grip. I'd drawn it maybe twice in my career, both times for animals that charged out of surprise or hunger. This felt different. Predatory, yes, but also curious. The beam of my headlamp caught movement at the edge of the chamber, a shape resolving out of shadow, tall, broad, too broad. Its outline wavered as it stepped forward, not quite fitting into the space, as if the cave itself resisted its presence. I couldn't see its face. The light slid off dark, matted hair that hung in clumps, catching on shoulders that rolled with each step. The smell intensified, filling my lungs, making my eyes water. It paused, head tilting slightly, and I had the distinct, horrifying sense that it was studying me. Denial is a powerful thing. Even then, even with my heart trying to break out of my chest, my mind scrambled for explanations that didn't involve the impossible. A bear with mange, a hoax, a trick of light and fear. Anything but what the old stories whispered about, anything but the word that crept unbidden into my thoughts and refused to leave. The thing took another step. The cave felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in, the ceiling lowering. I raised my weapon, hands steady despite everything screaming inside me to run. "Stay back," I said, my voice echoing uselessly, "I'm armed." It stopped again, lifted its head. For a brief, terrible second, the light caught its eyes. They reflected not like an animal's, but like a person's. Aware, focused, filled with something that looked uncomfortably like recognition. The hiker screamed then, a hoarse, broken sound that tore through the chamber. The thing reacted instantly, lunging forward with a speed that stole my breath. I fired without thinking, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. Stone chips flew. The smell of gunpowder mixed with musk and damp earth. The creature recoiled, not in pain but in surprise, letting out a roar that shook dust from the ceiling. I grabbed the hiker under his arms, hauling him backward, muscles burning, boots slipping. Another shot, another roar. The cave answered with echoes that made it impossible to tell where the sound came from. I dragged him toward the entrance, every step a fight against gravity and terror. The thing followed, slower now, its movements cautious, almost calculating. It reached out once, a massive hand slamming into the rock inches from my head, leaving fresh gouges where fingers met stone. We burst out of the cave into night air that felt impossibly cold and clean. I didn't stop to look back. I half carried, half dragged the hiker through the trees, branches tearing at my face, my pack, my skin. Behind us, something moved in parallel, crashing through undergrowth, always just out of sight. The forest was no longer silent. It was alive with sound, branches snapping, breath roaring in my ears, my own heartbeat pounding like a drum. I didn't know where I was going, only that stopping meant dying. I don't remember falling. I remember the ground rushing up, the impact knocking the wind from me. I remember rolling, clinging to the hiker, and then nothing. When I came to, dawn was breaking through the trees. The forest looked ordinary again. Birds called. Frost glittered on needles. The hiker lay beside me, unconscious but breathing. There were no tracks around us but our own. Search teams found us an hour later, guided by a weak signal that finally punched through to my radio. They asked questions. I gave answers that fit the forms and the reports. A fall, a bear, shock, exposure. No one pushed, not really. But sometimes late at night, I wake up with the smell of damp fur in my nose and the echo of that roar in my chest, and I know the forest let me go that night for reasons I still don't understand. I took a leave after that incident. Officially, it was to recover from the physical strain and the psychological shock of a near-fatal rescue. Unofficially, it was because every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that cave, feeling stone vibrate under my palms and seeing eyes that reflected thought, not instinct. The forest hadn't just frightened me. It had unsettled something foundational, my belief that the world, even at its most dangerous, followed rules. I returned to duty 3 months later, thinner, quieter, more careful with my words. The other rangers noticed, though no one said anything outright. In our line of work, silence is a form of courtesy. You don't force someone to explain what they aren't ready to name. The locals noticed too. At the general store, conversations paused when I walked in. Old men who had once slapped my shoulder now just nodded. One woman, she'd lived there her whole life, raised kids who moved away, looked at me with something like pity and said, "You went into the stone, didn't you?" I didn't answer. She didn't press. I tried to stay grounded in routine. Patrols, trail maintenance, visitor briefings. I doubled down on procedure, convinced discipline could rebuild the wall between my thoughts and the memories that pressed against them. For a while, it worked. The forest behaved itself. Summer came, bringing tourists and careless optimism. The caves stayed quiet. Then came the second story, the one that taught me fear doesn't always announce itself with noise and violence. Sometimes it comes disguised as responsibility. A family went missing in late September. Not deep backcountry explorers, just a couple with a teenage son camping near a developed site close enough to hear the highway if the wind was right. They were overdue by a day when the call came in. No note. No sign of struggle. Their campsite looked untouched, the fire ring cold, chairs still arranged in a loose circle as if they'd simply stepped away. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest as I walked the site. The ground showed no obvious tracks leading out. The tent was zipped from the outside. Their food was stored properly, bare canister locked and untouched. It was as if the forest had lifted them gently and set them somewhere else. Search and rescue mobilized fast. Dogs, drones, volunteers. I coordinated grids, my voice steady, my mind carefully compartmentalized. I told myself this was different. No caves, no isolation, no reason to think beyond the probable. On the second night, I took a solo sweep along a ridge overlooking the campsite. The sun dipped low, painting the pines in copper light. That's when I heard it. Not a roar, not footsteps, a call. It sounded almost human, a long, wavering sound that rose and fell like someone testing their voice in an empty room. It came from deeper in the forest, away from established trails. I froze, every muscle taut. The dogs down below began to whine, noses lifting to the air. I radioed it in, describing the direction, the quality of the sound. There was a pause on the line, just long enough to tell me the others heard the same unease I felt. Probably elk, someone said, but their voice lacked conviction. Elk bugles don't hesitate the way that sound did. They don't carry the faint echo of imitation. Against my better judgment, I followed it. The ridge dropped into a narrow valley choked with deadfall and thick brush. Light faded fast, shadows pooling between the trees. The call came again, closer now. I could almost make out words in it, syllables stretched and distorted like language remembered incorrectly. I thought of the family, of the boy old enough to wander, to chase a sound without understanding what it led to. The fear this time wasn't for myself. It was sharper, more urgent, a fear of failing others because of my own hesitation. The valley ended at a rock face split by another cave mouth, smaller than the first, but no less dark. The call stopped abruptly as I approached. My pulse hammered in my ears. I stood there, the weight of memory pressing down, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. Instead, I listened. From inside came the faintest sound of movement, a scuff, a breath. I called out the family's names, like my voice steady but loud enough to carry. The cave answered with silence. I didn't enter. I learned from the first time. I marked the location, backed away slowly, and radioed for backup. When we returned the next morning with a full team, the cave was empty. No tracks, no scent the dogs could follow. It was as if nothing had ever been there. 2 days later, we found the family. They were miles away near the park boundary, huddled together under a stand of young pines, alive, dehydrated, traumatized. The boy clung to his mother, shaking uncontrollably. The parents spoke in fragments, eyes darting at every sound. In the debrief, they told us what they could. They'd heard someone calling the boy's name the first night, thought it was another camper, followed the sound until the campsite lights were out of sight. After that, everything blurred. They remembered hiding, remembered something moving just beyond the firelight, staying where they could hear it but not see it. Remembered feeling watched. The boy said nothing, not then. Weeks later, I ran into him by chance at a ranger-led program near the visitor center. He stood apart from the group, hands shoved deep in his pockets, eyes fixed on the trees. When our gazes met, his face went pale. "It knew my name," he said quietly, as if sharing a secret. It said it wrong, like it learned it by listening. I wanted to tell him he was mistaken, that fear warps memory, that there are explanations. But the words stuck in my throat. I'd heard that sound myself, stretched and wrong, echoing through the valley. After that, the forest seemed closer somehow. Sounds carried farther. Shadows lingered longer. I began to notice patterns. Certain areas where equipment failed more often, where compasses wavered, where visitors reported a sense of being followed without ever seeing anyone. Always near stone. Always near places where the earth opened its mouth. I started reading on my own time. Old reports, handwritten logs from decades past, stories dismissed as folklore or stress-induced hallucination. They shared a shape, if not details. Something tall, something patient, something that used the forest's vastness as cover and the caves as refuge. Something that didn't hunt the way animals do, but waited. The more I learned, the more I understood the locals' caution. They didn't talk about these things openly because naming them felt like an invitation. The forest, in their eyes, was not malevolent, but it was not neutral either. It kept its own balance, and sometimes that balance required reminders of how small we are. I tried to keep that understanding to myself, to do my job, to draw lines I would not cross again. But fear has a way of seeping through even the strongest barriers, especially when you believe you've made peace with it. The third story, the one that finally broke something in me, began with a storm and a call that came in just before midnight. The storm had been building all evening, the kind that announces itself hours in advance with a pressure change you feel behind your eyes. By the time the call came in, rain was already needling against the station windows, and thunder rolled low and distant like something restless turning over in its sleep. 2 backcountry climbers hadn't checked in. Experienced ones, according to the permit records. Not tourists chasing photos, but men who knew how to read weather and terrain. Their last known location was near an abandoned mining cut high on the western slope, an area riddled with old shafts and collapsed tunnels, places we quietly discouraged people from visiting because maps never told the whole truth. I volunteered before anyone else could. Part of me wanted to prove, to myself more than anyone, that I was still capable, still in control. Another part knew the pattern too well by now to pretend coincidence. Stone. Caves. People vanishing at the edges of reason. The rain intensified as I drove, turning the access road into a ribbon of mud and shadow. Lightning flashed through the trees, freezing them into stark, skeletal shapes for split seconds at a time. I parked as close as I could get and continued on foot, poncho snapping in the wind, headlamp beam fractured by sheets of water. The forest at night in a storm doesn't feel alive the way it does on clear evenings. It feels irritated. Every branch seems poised to strike, every gust carries the threat of falling timber. My senses narrowed, focused on footing and breath and the steady forward rhythm that keeps panic at bay. I reached the mining cut just as the rain began to ease. The rock face loomed out of the darkness, scarred and uneven, a wound that never healed. Rusted equipment lay half buried in debris, relics of a time when men dug into the earth without understanding or caring what might look back. That's when I heard voices. Not shouts for help, not urgent calls, just conversation, low, indistinct, as if two people were talking calmly just out of sight. Relief surged through me so fast it left me dizzy. I called out, identifying myself, my voice echoing strangely against stone. The voices stopped. I moved closer, heart thudding, scanning the area. That familiar tension crept in again, a tightening that had nothing to do with the cold. "I can help you," I said, louder now. "Storm's not done yet." A pause, then one voice answered, hesitant, We're here." The sound came from the direction of a collapsed shaft, partially hidden by brush. I picked my way toward it, shining my light into the gap. The beam revealed nothing but rubble and darkness beyond. "Can you come out?" I asked. Another pause, too long. "We can't," the voice said. It's watching." The word hit me like a physical blow. I took a step back, every instinct flaring. Rain dripped from my hood, loud in the sudden quiet. "Who's watching you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer I feared. The second voice joined in then, overlapping the first, both speaking at once in a frantic rush. They talked about shadows that moved against the wrong light, about something tall standing just beyond the edge of their vision, about sounds that came from underground, reverberating through the rock and into their bones. They said it had followed them when the storm started, had driven them toward the shaft the way a shepherd drives sheep. I told them to stay calm, to keep talking to me. I radioed for backup, my fingers slick on the controls. Static answered, thick and unyielding. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the rock face, and for a split second, I saw movement higher up, a silhouette against stone, too tall to be a trick of shadow. It stood perfectly still, as if aware of the exact limits of my vision. When the thunder crashed, the voices screamed. Something moved in the rubble, stones shifting as if pushed from within. I shouted, running forward despite myself, beam of my light dancing wildly. One of the climbers burst from the gap, face white with terror, eyes locked on something behind him. He tripped, fell hard, scrambling backward on hands and knees. I reached him, grabbing his arm, hauling him to his feet. "Where's the other one?" I demanded. His mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. "It took him," he whispered. Before I could ask what he meant, the ground behind us erupted with sound, rock grinding against rock, a deep, resonant exhale that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The survivor bolted, dragging me with him, panic lending him strength he shouldn't have had left. We ran blind through the rain-slick forest, branches whipping our faces, thunder chasing us down the slope. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Some part of me knew that seeing too much was as dangerous as stopping. We didn't stop until we reached the truck, lungs burning, legs shaking. I shoved him inside, slammed the door, and threw myself behind the wheel. As I turned the engine over, the headlights swept the trees one last time. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond where the light faded into darkness, something stood and watched us leave. They never found the second climber. Officially, he was presumed dead, lost in the storm, buried by a collapse. The survivor refused interviews, refused counseling, left town as soon as he was physically able. I didn't blame him. After that night, I knew something fundamental had changed. The forest no longer felt like a place I worked in. It felt like a presence I was tolerated by. I began to understand the cave as more than a physical space. It was a boundary, a place where the forest's secrets pressed closest to the surface, where reason thinned and old things breathed easier. Every disappearance, every strange report traced back to those mouths in the stone. I still wear the badge. I still patrol the trails and answer the calls, but I no longer believe I'm the one in control. I warn people now, not with stories, but with urgency. I tell them to respect closed areas, to trust their instincts when the woods go quiet, to turn back when something feels wrong, even if they can't explain why. Because the pines remember. The stone listens. And there are spirits in this forest that don't need to be seen to be real. They're patient, they're learning, and they are still there waiting for the next voice, brave or foolish enough to answer when the forest calls their name wrong. I am recording this because the forest does not forget, and I am afraid that I'm beginning to. The first thing you should know is that I did not believe in patterns. Not the mystical kind, not the whispered, half-drunk stories tourists tell around fires. I believed in terrain, weather, human error. I believed in maps that could be wrong and people who could panic. I believed that most disappearances could be explained if you waited long enough and sifted through the debris of bad decisions. That belief lasted 16 years. It ended the night the ground spoke my name. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was a federal forest ranger assigned to a district that does not exist on most public maps. High elevation, low traffic, brutal winters, summers that cook the brain with heat, shimmer, and isolation. I took the job because I wanted distance from cities, from people, from a search case early in my career that never closed and never left me alone. Her name was Emily Hargreave, 7 years old, pink jacket, one boot found 30 yards from a trailhead that was so clearly marked you could see it from the parking lot. We searched for 12 days. Dogs lost her scent at a creek that had no reason to erase anything. No body, no blood, no sign she had ever left the trail. I signed the report. I testified. I watched her parents age 10 years in a month. After that, I volunteered for postings where the silence was supposed to be clean. It never is. The district I was assigned to had old-growth forests stitched together with abandoned mining roads, survey markers from the 1940s, and warning signs no one bothered to explain. There were pockets where radios died, places where compasses hesitated, then corrected themselves like they had made a mistake thinking too hard. Locals called those spots dead ground. The term was older than any of us. My first 6 months were uneventful. Paperwork, boundary patrols, the occasional lost hiker dehydrated and embarrassed. I slept well. I dreamed less. Then came the winter call that started the slow erosion. A lone vehicle abandoned on Forest Service Road 12C. Engine cold, driver's door open, no footprints leading away, snow untouched except for a shallow depression beside the car, as if someone had knelt and pressed their forehead to the ground. I remember thinking that detail was strange, then forcing myself to stop thinking about it. We canvassed the area. No missing persons report matched the vehicle. Plates were clean. VIN checked out. It took 3 days before a man from county called to tell us the registered owner had been reported missing by his wife 2 states away. He'd left for a business trip and never arrived. That should have been straightforward. It wasn't. We found no tracks, not leading into the forest, not leading out, no drag marks, no blood, no indication of struggle. The snow fell lightly that week, but not enough to erase everything. The absence itself felt intentional. On the 4th day, while I was flagging the perimeter, I heard what I thought was a radio squelch beneath my boot, a faint burst of static, low and muffled, like it was coming from under packed earth. I stopped, listened. It happened again, a breathy sound layered under the static, almost speech. I told myself it was ice shifting, buried debris, anything that fit inside physics. That night, back at the ranger station, I smelled burnt hair in my bunk room. Acrid. Clinging. I tore the place apart looking for a source. There was nothing. The smell faded only when I went outside into sub-zero air that felt strangely warm against my face. I didn't report it. Weeks later, a trail maintenance crew found a cave opening exposed by a partial collapse near an old prospecting site. It wasn't on any survey maps. The rock around it was smooth, melted looking, as if it had been sealed and reopened more than once. Cold air poured out in pulses, breathing against the daylight. I was assigned to assess it. The entrance sloped down sharply. My headlamp caught mineral veins and tool marks that were wrong, too precise for hand tools, too uneven for machines. The sound inside was oppressive, not echoing, just close. Every footstep sounded like it landed directly behind my ear. 30 feet in, I found a shoe, a man's dress shoe, polished, untouched by moisture, no dust, sitting perfectly upright in a shallow depression in the rock, as if the stone had formed around it. I recognized it instantly, same brand as the missing man's wife had described. I had written it down. I backed out without documenting it. I don't know why. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my camera twice. I remember the smell again. Burnt hair, sulfur, something animal and wet. I remember thinking of Emily's pink jacket, folded neatly on a log the way it had been found years ago, and feeling something in my chest compress like invisible hands. I sealed the cave. Filed a partial report. Recommended further geological survey. It was denied. Budget constraints. Weather concerns. The entrance collapsed again 2 weeks later on its own. After that, the forest changed its behavior. Sounds began lagging behind movement. I would turn my head and hear the branch snap a second later, as if the audio was delayed. Shadows leaned the wrong way at dusk. Reflections in frozen puddles showed me standing still when I was moving. Once, during a patrol near a frozen lake, I heard a child laughing beneath the ice. I lay flat and listened. The sound traveled under the surface, moving faster than I could track, circling. I pressed my ear to the ice and felt vibrations like fingers tapping from below. When the sound stopped, the ice was warm. I told no one. I started dreaming of tunnels, endless ribbed passages lined with metal and bone. Voices whispered procedural language, codes, coordinates, radio etiquette. Things I knew by heart, spoken wrong with emphasis in places that made my skin crawl. I would wake with frost on my beard in July. The next disappearance was a fellow ranger, Mark Alvarez, 23, fresh out of training, smart, careful. He vanished during a routine boundary check. His GPS unit was found still transmitting from a ravine that should not have been deep enough to hide a body, let alone swallow one whole. We rappelled down. Nothing, just bare rock and a smell like old pennies and wet fur. That night, his voice came over my radio. Not a distress call. Not screaming. Calm, asking for confirmation of coordinates that didn't exist. I answered before I could stop myself. The reply came back wrong. Slower, like it had to think about how radios worked. After that, my superior stopped returning my calls. Reports went unanswered. Locals avoided eye contact. An unmarked military convoy passed through one morning, blocking the only access road for 6 hours. No insignia. No explanation. When they left, several trailheads were quietly removed from the public map. I began to understand that the forest was not empty. It was attentive. I felt it when I walked. Pressure underfoot, subtle adjustments. The ground firmed or softened in places that guided me without asking. At night, something brushed my ankles inside my cabin, testing. The walls whispered as metal cooled, but the whispers used my name. I am rational. I have always been. I wrote everything down, cross-checked, measured temperatures that made no sense. Heat blooms in snowfields, frost blooming on sun-warmed stone. The data did not argue with me. It waited. The last assignment I accepted was a sealed site flagged by a satellite anomaly. An underground structure unaccounted for in any records. Bunker, maybe, or a mine repurposed. I was told to assess and report, alone. The entrance was marked by a symbol carved into the rock, worn smooth by time or hands or something else. It looked less like a warning and more like an instruction. As I stood there, listening to the earth breathe beneath me, the ground vibrated, just once, and something far below answered back in a voice that had practiced being human. This is not the end of what happened. It is where I stopped pretending I was still in control. I told myself the vibration was machinery. Old generators, air moving through shafts, anything that preserved a world where cause preceded effect. I stepped inside anyway. The entrance dropped into a concrete throat, reinforced with steel ribs that sweated moisture despite the dry air outside. My headlamp revealed warning stencils in a font I didn't recognize. Too rounded, too deliberate. The language wasn't English, but it wasn't symbolic either. It felt instructional, like a checklist carved by someone who expected compliance. The temperature inverted the moment I crossed the threshold. Outside, it was late autumn, cold enough to numb fingers. Inside, heat rolled up from below in waves, smelling faintly of copper, rot, and something chemical that stung the back of my throat. My breath fogged once, then stopped. The air was warm enough to feel alive. I logged my position. The radio answered with a half-second delay, my own voice coming back flatter, stripped of inflection. The tunnel sloped down for what my altimeter said was nearly 100 feet, then leveled out into a corridor wide enough for vehicles that had never come. Tire marks were absent. Footprints, too. The floor was smooth, almost polished, with shallow grooves running parallel like something heavy had been dragged repeatedly back and forth until the stone learned the shape. Sound behaved badly down there. Every movement I made felt absorbed, muted, while distant noises, metal ticks, low thumps, the suggestion of breathing, arrived sharp and close, as if whispered directly into my skull. About 50 yards in, I found the first door. It was circular, submarine style, welded shut from the outside. The welds were old but intact. Someone had wanted this closed permanently. Someone else had scratched into the metal around the seam. Names, dates, short phrases layered over decades. Help us, we're still working. It learns your voice. Do not answer. The handwriting varied wildly, some careful, some frantic, some carved so deeply the metal peeled outward like skin. I felt a pressure behind my eyes then, like altitude sickness without the altitude. My ears popped. For a moment I smelled pine sap and wood smoke, clean memories that didn't belong here. Emily's laugh surfaced unbidden. Mark's grin the day he first put on the uniform. I backed away from the door and nearly collided with something standing in the corridor behind me. It was just a shadow, no body attached. A darker absence shaped like a person, stretched long by a light source that didn't exist. When I turned fully, it collapsed into the wall, absorbed without sound. I stood there shaking, cataloging symptoms, stress, isolation, sensory deprivation. I reminded myself hallucinations don't leave marks. Something brushed my ankle. I looked down in time to see the fabric of my pant leg depress inward, as if pressed by invisible fingers. The pressure lingered, then slid away toward the darkness ahead. I moved faster after that. The corridor branched into a larger chamber where the ceiling rose out of my light's reach. Rows of equipment lined the walls, consoles, racks, monitors, all dead, all dustless. Not abandoned. Waiting. Thick cables disappeared into the floor, pulsing faintly like veins beneath translucent skin. In the center of the room was a pit, a circular opening 15 feet across, ringed with metal handholds worn smooth. Heat poured out of it in steady waves. When I leaned close, I heard voices layered deep below, overlapping conversations in different tones and cadences. Some I recognized. Mark's voice, calm, asking for confirmation of coordinates. Emily's voice, older than she should have been, singing something tuneless, my own voice, speaking words I had not yet said. I staggered back and vomited. The smell that rose from the pit intensified, burnt hair, blood, ozone. I wiped my mouth and realized the ground beneath my hands was vibrating, subtle but constant, like a massive engine idling far below. I tried my radio again, static. Then a clear channel opened. Dan, it said, my voice, but steadier. You're early. I demanded identification, protocol, chain of command. The response came instantly, perfectly formatted, referencing operations I had never been briefed on but somehow understood in my bones. It spoke of containment, of monitoring, of acceptable losses. I asked what was being contained. There was a pause, long enough to feel deliberate. Us, the radio said, as we were. The lights flickered on then. Not harsh illumination, soft amber like emergency lighting designed to be comforting. The chamber revealed more detail, scratches on the walls at human height, handprints burned into metal. In one corner, a row of bunks with personal effects still neatly arranged, photos, dog tags, a child's drawing pinned above one pillow, a forest with eyes in the trees. I recognized one of the names on the tags, a ranger who'd retired before I joined. Officially died of cancer. He was smiling in the photo, arm around someone whose face had been scratched out. The pit pulsed. The The voices below synchronized, chanting something too low to parse. My chest tightened as invisible cold pressed down, constricting my lungs. Frost bloomed on the metal rail despite the heat. I realized then that the structure wasn't a bunker. It was a throat. Something massive lived beneath the district, woven into bedrock and history, fed by disappearances written off as wilderness attrition. The land didn't just remember screams, it recycled them. And we had been helping. The radio crackled again. "You can leave," it said, "or you can stay and make sure it doesn't follow." I thought of the sealed caves, the unmarked convoys, the way reports vanished. I thought of how the ground guided my steps, gently, patiently, like it had been waiting for me to understand my role. I edged toward the pit despite myself. The handholds were warm, almost slick. Below, something shifted, adjusting to my presence. The voices quieted, listening. I don't remember deciding to descend. I remember the feeling of hands, human and not, steadying me as I climbed down into the heat and the dark, the walls closing in like a mouth, learning a new shape. When my radio hit the edge and clattered into the pit ahead of me, it landed upright and began transmitting. Not static, breathing. The climb down took longer than it should have. The handholds repeated at perfect intervals, identical wear patterns, as if thousands of people with the same height, the same reach, the same hesitation had descended before me. Heat thickened with every meter, pressing sweat out of my skin while the air itself felt refrigerated, a paradox that made my joints ache and my thoughts stutter. Below me, the breathing deepened. Not lungs, something broader. A pressure rhythm that traveled through stone and bone alike. Each exhale stirred dust from the walls. Each inhale tugged gently at my boots, encouraging, patient. I counted steps to stay anchored. Lost track around 140. The walls began to change texture. Smooth concrete, giving way to bare rock, then to something fibrous, ribbed, faintly elastic. My gloves came away damp. I did not look at what coated them. The voices resumed when I reached the bottom. They were closer now, individual, intimate, no longer layered chaos but discrete speakers, standing just out of sight, breathing with me. I heard Mark first, then a woman I'd helped evacuate during a wildfire years ago, then a supervisor who'd signed my performance reviews. They spoke softly, conversationally, commenting on my progress, my breathing rate, my heart. I knew better than to answer. The chamber at the base was vast, cathedral-like, its ceiling lost in shadow. The floor sloped gently toward a central mass that my light struggled to define. Cables or tendons ran from it into the surrounding rock, disappearing in every direction. Some pulsed faintly. Others lay still, dormant, waiting. The smell was overwhelming now. Wet fur, blood gone sweet with age. The sterile tang of disinfectant layered over decay, like an operating room that had never been cleaned properly. I realized with a jolt of clarity that this place had not been built around the thing. The thing had been built around us. The central mass shifted. My light caught on surfaces that reflected wrong. Too matte to be metal, too structured to be flesh. Patterns rippled across it in response to my movement, like a skin learning how to display interest. From within, shapes pressed outward briefly. Faces, hands, impressions that almost resolved before dissolving back into the whole. I staggered as something brushed my mind, not intrusive, just present. A cataloging touch. Assessing. Images flooded me unbidden. Search grids. Missing posters. Reports stamped closed without bodies. Faces I recognized from years in service, faces I had tried to forget. The thing wasn't showing me memories, it was verifying inventory. A sharp sound rang out behind me, metal striking stone. I spun, weapon raised, to see my radio lying cracked near the base of the shaft. Its speaker hissed, then emitted my own voice again, clearer than before. "Subject shows high resilience," it said calmly. "Long-term exposure has produced adaptive denial and functional dissociation." I shouted then. Not words, just sound. The chamber swallowed it whole. The pressure returned, stronger this time, invisible weight compressing my chest. Frost formed along my sleeves despite sweat soaking my back. I dropped to one knee, gasping, while the mass ahead of me leaned closer, or perhaps the room itself contracted. Perspective lost meaning. A shape detached from the central structure and slid forward on unseen supports. It resolved slowly into something approximating human proportions, assembled from textures stolen from memory. Fabric like a ranger's uniform, skin tones that didn't quite match, a face that shifted subtly as it searched for the correct configuration. It smiled using Mark's mouth. "Don't be afraid," it said, and the phrase carried a dozen emotional calibrations layered beneath it. Concern, authority, familiarity. You're not being consumed, you're being archived. I demanded answers again, clinging to procedure like a life raft. The thing listened attentively, nodding at appropriate intervals, mimicking empathy with unsettling precision. "We are a safeguard," it said. "A containment strategy initiated when human expansion exceeded acceptable thresholds. You call it wilderness, we call it margin." I laughed then, hysterical and broken. I accused it of murder, of predation, of theft. It considered this, adjusted its stance. "We prevent cascade failure," it replied. "You remove yourselves inefficiently. We curate." The word hit harder than any threat. The thing gestured, and the chamber walls brightened as translucent panels slid open, revealing alcoves embedded in the rock. Inside each was a human form suspended in a gel-like medium, eyes closed, expressions peaceful. Some wore uniforms, some wore hiking gear, some were children. Emily was there. She looked older, maybe 15, her pink jacket long gone. Her face was serene, unmarked, alive in a way that mocked every grave I'd ever stood beside. I crawled toward her alcove, sobbing, nails scraping stone. The gel pulsed as I approached, warming. Her eyes fluttered. The thing intercepted me effortlessly, its grip firm but not painful. "She is stable," it said. "Removal would degrade her function, as it would yours," I begged then. "Promise silence. Compliance. Anything." The thing listened, genuinely curious, as if studying an unfamiliar behavior. "You are already compliant," it said gently. "You brought yourself here." I realized then how many choices I thought I had made freely, how often the ground had guided me, how the forest had whispered warnings I'd mistaken for instinct. The guilt I carried was not incidental. It was leverage. The chamber trembled suddenly. A deep, distant shudder traveled through the cables, rattling the alcoves. The thing paused, head cocked, listening inward. "Surface activity," it said. "Expansion event. Increased observation risk." It turned back to me, eyes rearranging into my own. "We require a mobile interface," it continued. "Someone who understands your systems, your languages, your protocols." The implications settled heavy and final. I felt something reach into me then, not a physical intrusion, but a threading. Memories unspooled, examined, braided with others, training manuals, radio codes, personal failures, the fear of becoming like those who vanished. I understood with terrible clarity that resistance was not required, only acceptance. The ground vibrated again, stronger, impatient. Somewhere far above, I imagined hikers laughing, unaware of the heat blooming beneath their feet, of the breath under the soil. I don't remember leaving the chamber. I remember waking at dawn near my truck, boots muddy, uniform torn, radio gone. A new report waiting on my dash, neatly typed, requiring my signature. Another disappearance. Unexplained. Closed. My hands signed it without shaking. Since then, the forest has been quieter, more orderly. When people go missing now, it feels intentional, managed. At night, when the ground hums beneath my cabin, I hum back, unconsciously, matching its rhythm. Sometimes I dream of tunnels and wake with dirt under my nails. Sometimes I hear my voice on the radio, guiding a younger ranger toward a place not marked on any map. If you are listening to this because you found the recording, know this: the wilderness is not hostile. It is efficient, and it remembers who helps. I have been told by people who still believe in timelines that this is where the record should end, that anything after my return is unreliable, compromised, symptomatic. I understand why they say that. It's cleaner to draw a line around the moment a man stops being fully himself and label everything beyond it as noise. The forest prefers continuity. After the bunker, time loosened. Days arrived out of order. Some mornings I woke already exhausted, boots muddy before I put them on, paperwork completed in my own handwriting that I could not remember doing. Other days passed without leaving a mark at all. like skipped frames in a damaged reel. No one questioned my reports anymore. Supervisors nodded too quickly. Calls ended before I finished speaking. When I requested resources, they arrived unlogged. When I recommended closures, maps updated themselves. The district shrank quietly, trails erased, access roads downgraded to unsafe, then forgotten. The public accepted it with the same passive obedience they give weather. I told myself I was protecting people. That lie lasted longer than most. The forest rewarded me with small mercies. The voices stopped arguing. The dreams became instructional instead of chaotic. When I followed the guidance, turned left instead of right, delayed a patrol, rerouted a search, the ground felt solid, approving. When I resisted, it softened beneath my feet, threatened to open. Once I tried to hike out beyond the boundary alone. No radio, no vehicle. I made it 2 miles before the terrain subtly rearranged itself. Familiar landmarks slid out of alignment. The air grew thick and metallic. I smelled burnt hair again and felt that invisible cold settle on my chest, firm but not cruel. A voice rose from the soil beneath me, not speaking words, just shaping intention. Not yet. I went back. The disappearances continued, but they changed in texture. Fewer accidents, more intent. People who wandered off trails did so with a dreamlike calm, stepping willingly into places they would later swear they had never seen before. They described feeling called, not frightened, relieved even. I recognized that feeling. It was the same one I'd had my entire career, standing at the edge of search grids, believing, wrongly, that I was choosing where to look. The first time I saw the alcoves again after the bunker was months later, during what I told myself was a nightmare. But nightmares don't leave dirt under your fingernails or frostbite on your hands in August. I stood in a new chamber then, deeper than the first, where the walls were no longer rock or concrete, but something grown to specification. The shapes inside the alcoves had multiplied, generations layered together. Some eyes were open now, tracking movement, learning. Emily was gone. In her place was a shape not yet finished, taller, thinner. Its surface rippled as if waiting for instruction. When I reached out, it mirrored my gesture a fraction of a second too late. The thing, no, the system, observed silently. It no longer needed to speak. Its intentions were already threaded through my thoughts, my reflexes, my sense of duty. We were expanding. The forest above responded accordingly. Trees leaned inward over forgotten paths. Snow fell where it shouldn't. Heat bloomed where it was lethal. Sounds misbehaved. Reflections lied. The environment learned to hunt gently, nudging rather than chasing. I signed more closures, filed more reports. Each one felt like erasing a name from a ledger I pretended not to read. The guilt never left. That surprised me. I had assumed assimilation would dull it, smooth it away. Instead, the system preserved it carefully like a vital organ. Guilt sharpened my compliance. Guilt kept me useful. I began to understand the older rangers then, the ones who retired suddenly, eyes hollow, voices careful. Some had walked into the forest and never returned. Others had returned too completely, smiling, eager to mentor. We were not all chosen the same way. Some were taken because they were lost, some because they were curious, some because they had already proven they could live with unanswered questions. The final event, the one that convinced me to record this, was not a disappearance. It was a recovery. A group of hikers stumbled out near a decommissioned road at dawn, hypothermic but alive, babbling about a place under the mountain where people slept standing up and the walls breathed. They were pulled from the district before I arrived. Black vehicles, no insignia, efficient hands. One of them locked eyes with me as they were loaded into an ambulance. "You told us where to go," she whispered, on the radio. I had not been on the radio that night, but somewhere beneath us, something had been practicing my voice. That was when I realized the system no longer required my consent. Only my precedent. I am still officially a ranger. My credentials work, my face clears checkpoints, but I avoid the deeper zones now, not out of fear, but out of something closer to shame. The system does not reprimand me. It waits. It knows I am still recording. It knows confession is another form of transmission. If you are hearing this and thinking it's fiction, that's expected. The forest depends on skepticism. It flourishes in rational minds that demand proof and dismiss patterns as coincidence. If you are hearing this and feeling something tighten in your chest, a sense of recognition you can't explain, then you have already brushed the margin. Listen carefully now. Do not follow voices that use your name. Do not trust ground that feels too welcoming. If a trail seems to rearrange itself to make your choice easier, turn around. If you hear breathing where there should only be wind, leave everything and run. And if a ranger, someone calm, experienced, reassuring, tells you an area is safe because they've walked it 100 times before, ask yourself why no one else has. I am still here. The forest has not decided what to do with me yet. When it does, there will be no warning, only silence. My name doesn't matter as much as the years I've spent carrying it through the woods. I was 38 when this all began to unravel, though I'd already been a ranger for over a decade by then. Long enough to believe I understood the land. Long enough to think fear was something you managed, like weather or wildfire. I worked a remote stretch of national forest tucked into the northern mountains, a place of dense pine stands, granite ridgelines, and valleys so deep the sunlight arrived late and left early. Locals called it old land. Not in a poetic way, more like a warning disguised as tradition. The people who lived near the forest were few. Loggers who'd aged out of the work but never left. Families who'd been there so long their last names doubled as road signs. They didn't hike for fun, they didn't camp unless they had to. And when they spoke about the woods, they did it the way you talk about a neighbor with a temper. Carefully, respectfully, never too loudly. I didn't grow up there. I came in with a badge, a radio, and a belief in systems. Maps, procedures, search grids. I believed that every lost hiker could be found if you worked the problem long enough, that every strange noise had a biological explanation, that every shadow eventually resolved into something ordinary once your eyes adjusted. I believed the forest was indifferent, not hostile. Beautiful, yes, but neutral. That belief carried me through my early years, through the routine calls, through the injuries and the rescues and the occasional body recovered too late. I learned the rhythms of the place, the way the wind threaded itself through the pines like breath through teeth, the way snow muted distance, the way silence could mean peace or warning, depending on how suddenly it arrived. I learned where people usually got lost and where animals like to bed down. I learned which trails lulled you into complacency before turning cruel. And then there was the cave. It wasn't on any official map. It sat halfway up a limestone escarpment in the northern sector, hidden behind a curtain of scrub pine and boulder fall. Locals knew it. They never went inside. When asked why, they'd say it was unstable, or flooded, or sacred. The explanation shifted depending on who you asked, which should have been my first clue. But the official stance was simple. No public access, no reported incidents, no reason to investigate. The first strange situation tied to that cave didn't announce itself as strange at all. It came in as a routine welfare check. A solo camper overdue by 2 days, last seen at a trailhead about 5 miles south of the escarpment. Weather had been clear, no medical alerts, no history of risk-taking behavior, just a man who hadn't come back when expected. I took the call because I was closest. I remember the way the forest felt that morning. Too still, like it was holding something back. The pines stood rigid, their needles barely stirring, and even the birds seemed reluctant to announce themselves. My boots pressed into the duff with a softness that made each step feel intrusive. I told myself I was projecting, that long shifts and too much coffee could turn any quiet morning into a mood. About 2 miles in, I found the first sign he'd passed that way, a snapped branch at shoulder height, filled up the pale wood still raw beneath the bark. Another half mile, and there were footprints off trail, heading north, deeper into country that sloped sharply upward, not the direction you'd choose unless you were following something, or being led. I radioed in my position and followed. As the terrain steepened, the forest closed ranks. Pines grew tighter, their trunks crowding out the sky. The air smelled different there, damp stone and old rot layered beneath the evergreen. I began to hear something that didn't fit the rest of the soundscape. A low, irregular rhythm. Not quite a footstep, not quite wind. It came and went, just at the edge of hearing, like a thought you try not to finish. I stopped twice, holding my breath, listening. Each time, the sound stopped when I did. That was when doubt first crept in. Not fear, not yet. Just the uncomfortable awareness that my instincts were firing in ways I couldn't immediately justify. I told myself it was acoustics, terrain funneling sound, maybe an animal pacing me out of curiosity. Bears did that sometimes. So did mountain lions, though they preferred to stay silent. The footprints led me to the base of the escarpment. Up close, the cave mouth looked less like an opening and more like a wound. The rock around it was darker, stained by water and time, and the air spilling out carried a chill that didn't match the temperature outside. I stood there longer than I should have, hand resting on the radio, heart beating just fast enough to notice. Protocol said not to enter alone. Protocol also said missing persons took priority. I called out his name. My voice sounded wrong in that place. Thin, fragile. It went in and didn't come back the way voices usually do. No echo, no reflection, just swallowed. I took one step inside and felt the ground change beneath my boot, from pine needles to bare stone, slick with moisture. The light dropped off sharply, my headlamp carving narrow tunnels through the dark. The smell intensified. Old water, minerals, something faintly organic like fur, left too long in the rain. That was when I heard it clearly for the first time. A breath, not mine. It came from deeper in the cave, slow and deliberate, carrying a weight to it that suggested lungs far larger than any animal I knew belonged in those mountains. I froze, every training module suddenly useless, every rational explanation lining up and falling apart before it reached my mouth. "Hello?" I called, hating the way the word trembled. The breathing stopped. In the silence that followed, my denial did its best work. I told myself I'd imagined it. That stress and isolation could make the mind reach for patterns where none existed. I told myself I'd come too far to turn back over a phantom sound. Then something shifted in the dark. Stone scraped against stone, slowly, purposefully. My body reacted before my thoughts caught up. I stepped back, heart hammering, headlamp swinging wildly. For just a fraction of a second, the beam caught a shape. Tall, impossibly broad, its outline broken by hanging strands that could have been hair or shadow. 2 points of reflected light flared and vanished. I ran. I didn't radio. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned and the forest opened up enough to let the sky back in. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel of my truck. Later, when the search team went in together, they found the missing man's pack near the cave entrance. No blood, no tracks leading deeper. Just the pack, set down carefully, as if he decided to leave it behind. The official report listed exposure as the likely cause. No further action recommended. I accepted that explanation because I needed to. But from that day on, every time the wind moved through the pines just right, I heard breathing beneath it. And every time I passed that escarpment, I felt the weight of something watching, patient and unafraid, waiting for me to stop pretending the forest was neutral. I told myself the incident ended there, at the edge of the trailhead, with my hands still shaking and my pulse slowly returning to something like normal. I filed the report, used the language expected of me, and let the bureaucracy smooth the sharp edges into something manageable. That was the deal I made with myself. I would give the forest my labor and my silence, and in return, it would let me keep my sense of order. That deal did not hold. The weeks after the cave stayed quiet on the surface, but something in me had shifted. I began to notice patterns I'd dismissed before. Hikers who swore they heard their names called from off-trail. Hunters who felt watched so intensely they abandoned their blinds mid-morning. Locals who stopped me not to complain or ask for help, but just to ask carefully whether things felt different lately. They never specified what things meant. They didn't have to. I started avoiding the northern sector without consciously deciding to. When dispatch assigned me elsewhere, I didn't argue. When another ranger volunteered to cover that area, I let him. I told myself it was coincidence. Fatigue. A desire for variety after too many years on the same ground. Denial is a quiet thing. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in like fog, blurring edges until you stop realizing what you're not seeing. The second incident came late in the fall, when the first snow dusted the higher elevations and the forest took on that stripped-down look, branches bare, sounds carrying farther, mistakes harder to hide. A call came in just before dusk. 2 teenage brothers overdue from a day hike near an abandoned logging spur not far from the escarpment. Their truck was still at the pullout. Their phones went straight to voicemail. I recognized the location immediately. I considered asking for backup. I considered citing protocol. What I did instead was grab my pack and head out alone, driven by a stubborn need to prove to myself more than anyone else that the cave hadn't broken me, that fear hadn't claimed ground it didn't deserve. The trail in was narrow and poorly maintained, choked with fallen needles and early snow. The light faded fast, turning the world blue and then gray. My breath sounded loud in my ears, each exhale a reminder that I was very much alive, very much human. I followed the spur until it dissolved into a tangle of brush and rock, then pushed on, guided by memory and a GPS that lagged just enough to make me uneasy. I found their tracks first. 2 sets of boots, fresh, overlapping, heading uphill toward terrain that offered nothing scenic and no clear destination. Teenagers did dumb things, but they weren't reckless. Not these 2. I'd met them once at a ranger station open house. Polite, curious, more interested in maps than thrills. The tracks led to a narrow ravine where the snow lay thin and uneven. The air there felt heavier, pressed down by the rock walls on either side. Sound behaved strangely. A snapped twig echoed like a rifle crack. My radio hissed with static that came and went without explanation. That was when I heard the voices. At first, I thought it was them, calling to each other, maybe shouting my name after hearing me approach. Relief surged so hard it made me lightheaded. I called back, my voice echoing up the ravine, and started moving faster. The voices stopped, then one of them spoke again, closer this time. It used my name. The sound of it hit me like cold water, not because it was impossible, I wore a name tape after all, but because of the way it was said. Flat. Careful. As if the speaker were tasting the word, unsure of how it was meant to feel in a mouth. I stopped where I was. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to put distance between myself and whatever waited ahead. Instead, I stood there, frozen by the collision of training and terror. People in distress sometimes did strange things. Shock could twist a voice. Echoes could distort direction. I told myself all of that while my heart tried to claw its way out of my chest. I advanced slowly, calling out again, this time using the brothers' names. The ravine widened into a bowl-shaped clearing littered with boulders and deadfall. My headlamp swept across it in jagged arcs, illuminating snow-dusted stone and the black mouths of spaces between rocks. Over here, the voice said. It came from behind me. I spun, beam snapping around, and caught sight of movement at the edge of the clearing. Something tall retreating into the trees with a speed that didn't match its size. I caught no clear details, just the impression of mass and a strange, loping grace that made my stomach drop. Panic surged, hot and immediate. I forced hookup with my radio, thumb jabbing the transmit button, and called for assistance, my words tumbling over each other. Static. Answered me. Then a burst of feedback so sharp, I ripped the earpiece out. The silence followed felt intentional. I backed toward the center of the clearing, putting open ground at my back. Snow crunched nearby, slow, deliberate steps circling just beyond the reach of my light. I caught glimpses of movement between the trunks, shadows breaking and reforming too quickly to track. "Show yourself," I shouted, hating the tremor in my voice. Something answered. Not in words, in sound. A low, resonant call rolled through the trees, vibrating in my chest more than my ears. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a howl. It was closer to a warning, layered with a complexity that suggested intention, intelligence. The forest responded. Birds erupted from branches. Snow cascaded from limbs. The ground itself seemed to hum beneath my boots. I don't remember deciding to run. I remember running. Branches tore at my jacket. Rocks sent me sprawling more than once. Each fall felt final, the kind of mistake you don't get to recover from. But I clawed my way up and kept moving, driven by a certainty that stopping meant disappearing. The sound followed me, not fast, not frantic, but steady. Confident, I broke out onto the logging road just as my lungs gave out. I collapsed against a tree, gasping, vision tunneling. The sound stopped at the tree line. I felt it there, just beyond sight, close enough that I could almost imagine warmth radiating from it into the cold air. Then it was gone. Search teams found the brothers the next morning, huddled together beneath an overhang less than a mile from where I'd last seen their tracks. Hypothermic, but alive. They'd told the same story separately, without prompting. Something had followed them, something that spoke like them, but wrong. Something that led them in circles until they stopped trusting their own ears. The official explanation cited stress-induced auditory hallucinations and environmental disorientation. I signed off on it. But that night, alone in my cabin, I dreamed of a cave breathing in the dark and of voices learning to sound human. After the brothers were reunited with their family and the reports were filed away under language designed to end questions, I stopped sleeping through the night. When I did sleep, it came in shallow fragments, dreams bleeding into waking moments, until I wasn't always sure which side of consciousness I was on. I'd wake convinced I heard footsteps outside my cabin, slow and deliberate, stopping just short of the porch. I'd lie there, counting my breaths, telling myself the forest was full of ordinary sounds, wind, animals, settling wood, telling myself that fear was just a response, not a truth. What unsettled me most wasn't what I'd seen or heard. It was the pattern emerging beneath it all. The way these encounters nudged people, not chased them outright, not attacked, but guided them, turned them around, drew them toward places the forest seemed to want remembered, toward the cave. Winter settled in hard that year. Snow stacked high enough to erase trails, to simplify the world into white and shadow. Calls dropped off as visitation slowed, but the radio never stayed quiet for long. There were reports of strange tracks crossing frozen creeks where no animal should have been able to pass without breaking through. There were distant knocks heard at night, 3 slow impacts against tree trunks spaced too evenly to be chance. Loggers refused certain access roads, claiming equipment malfunctioned there without reason. Engines stalled. Batteries drained overnight. I listened, I documented, I did not investigate. Until the call came from one of our own. He was younger than me, newer to the district, still carrying that confidence I'd once mistaken for immunity. He'd taken over much of the northern sector coverage after I quietly redirected my time elsewhere. The call came in near dusk, his voice strained but controlled. He reported finding a series of deep impressions in the snow near the escarpment, far larger than any bear track, with a stride that defied the slope. "I think someone's messing with us," he said, "or something's wrong with the ground up here." I asked him to pull back, to mark the location and wait for daylight. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "I hear something." The transmission cut out mid-sentence. I didn't wait for authorization. I didn't wait for backup. The moment the radio went dead, the decision was already made. Whatever line I'd been trying to hold, to stay away, to stay rational, collapsed under the weight of responsibility and something closer to guilt. I knew that terrain. I knew what waited there, and I knew that pretending otherwise had already cost too much. Night had fully settled by the time I reached the base of the escarpment. Snow muted my approach, turning each step into a soft compression rather than a sound. The forest felt tighter than ever, trees closing in, branches arching overhead like ribs. My headlamp carved a narrow cone through the dark, and beyond it, everything felt alive with watching. I found his tracks easily. They led exactly where I knew they would. The cave mouth yawned wider than I remembered, its edges crusted with ice that glistened faintly in my light. A second set of impressions stood just outside, boots planted close together, toes pointed inward, as if he'd stopped abruptly. There were drag marks leading inside. I called his name. No answer. The air spilling from the cave was warmer now, carrying that same layered smell. Stone, water, something organic. Alive. I stood there longer than I had any right to, arguing with myself in the space between heartbeats. Training told me to wait. Experience told me what happened when you ignored this place for too long. I went in. The light reached farther than before, or maybe my eyes had adjusted to reading less. The walls bore marks I hadn't noticed on my first visit. Long, shallow grooves running parallel to each other, too regular to be erosion. The floor sloped downward, leading deeper than the narrow openings suggested. Water dripped somewhere ahead, each drop a measured punctuation. I found his radio first, cracked against a rock, the casing bent inward as if crushed in a fist. Then his pack, straps torn. No blood. No signs of a struggle in the way we defined it. The breathing started again. It came from all around me this time, echoing off stone in a way that made direction meaningless. Slow. Steady. I felt it in my chest, a pressure that synced uncomfortably with my own lungs, as if something were trying to remind me how small my rhythms were by comparison. "Give him back," I said, my voice low, the words chosen without thought. The darkness shifted. Something moved at the edge of my light, then stepped fully into it. I saw enough to know my mind would never be the same. It stood taller than any man I'd met, its frame thick with muscle beneath a coat of matted hair that hung in uneven lengths. Its face, if that word applied, was a study in suggestion rather than detail. Deep-set eyes reflecting my lamp, a broad nose flattened by time, a mouth that moved with unsettling precision when it spoke. "Why?" it asked. The word was clear, shaped correctly, spoken with a voice that carried the echo of many others layered beneath it. Fear gave way to something colder, heavier. Understanding. "You don't belong here," I said, though even as I spoke it I knew how hollow that sounded. Belonging was a human construct. The cave had been there long before badges and boundaries. It tilted its head, considering me. I had the sense not of hostility, but of evaluation, like an old intelligence measuring whether I was worth the effort. "Neither do you," it replied. Behind it, shapes moved, suggestions of others. Not all the same size, not all breathing at the same pace. The realization settled in with a terrible calm. This wasn't a solitary thing. It was a presence, a lineage, the forest's memory given form. I don't remember how I got out of the cave. I remember stumbling into cold air, retching until my ribs ached. I remember snow soaking through my gloves as I crawled away from the opening. I remember a sound behind me, not pursuit, but something closer to disappointment. They found the younger ranger's body in the spring when the thaw gave up what winter had hidden. He was miles from where he'd last transmitted, laid gently beneath a stand of pines as if placed there. Cause of death was listed as exposure. The report was clean, final. After that, I requested reassignment, administrative duty, training, anything that put walls between me and the trees. The request was granted without comment, as if the system itself understood the need for distance. But distance doesn't erase knowledge. Years have passed since then. I don't wear the uniform anymore, but the forest hasn't let me go. Sometimes when the wind moves through the pines just right, I hear that breathing again, slow, patient, enduring. Sometimes I hear my name spoken in a voice that remembers it better than I do. The locals still whisper about the cave, about spirits that guard old places and punish those who wander too far. I don't correct them. Spirits is as good a word as any for things that don't fit inside reason. What I've learned, what I carry with me, is this. The forest is not empty. It is not neutral. It is crowded with memory and intention, with watchers who learned long ago how fragile we are. We walk there believing ourselves the protectors, the stewards, the ones in control. But the pines remember a time before us, and they are patient enough to wait for us to remember it too. I left the service quietly. No ceremony, no speeches about years served, just a signature on a form and a handover of keys that felt heavier than they should have. People assumed burnout. They always do. It's an explanation that makes everyone comfortable because it suggests an ending. A line you cross and then move on from. But nothing ended. I moved farther south, into a town that brushed up against the edge of another forest. Different mountains, different soil, different names on the maps. I told myself that distance mattered, that whatever lived in those northern pines was bound to that place, to that cave, to that specific convergence of stone and time. That was another lie I needed in order to keep breathing. At first, the woods here felt quiet in a way I'd forgotten was possible. The trees were younger, the trails wider. The air didn't press down on you with the same weight of age. I walked them in the early mornings, trying to convince my body that a forest could simply be a forest again. I focused on ordinary details, the smell of damp leaves, the chatter of squirrels, the clean geometry of sunlight through branches. It worked for a while. Then came the dreams. They weren't replays of the cave or the things I'd seen there. They were subtler than that. I dreamed of tunnels opening beneath familiar places, of roots pulling back to reveal darkness that shouldn't exist under shallow soil. I dreamed of standing at the mouth of something vast, knowing without being told that it had always been there, waiting for me to notice. I'd wake with my heart racing, convinced I'd heard breathing in the room. Not loud, not threatening, just present. I started researching in a way I never had while I wore the uniform. Not official reports, those I knew too well, but the margins. Old journals, local histories written by people without credentials. Indigenous accounts translated poorly, stripped of context, but still carrying echoes of something deeper. Different names surfaced in different regions, but the descriptions overlapped in ways that made my skin prickle. Tall watchers, cave dwellers, mimics, guardians, warnings mistaken for monsters. They weren't all violent. That was the detail that haunted me most. Again and again, the stories emphasized boundaries, respect, consequence. These beings didn't hunt indiscriminately. They reacted, they corrected, they removed those who refused to listen. I began to see my experiences not as attacks, but as escalations. The first time, I'd been warned. The second, tested. The third had been a lesson written in bloodless ink, but permanent all the same. What finally broke the illusion of distance happened years later, on a trail I'd walked dozens of times without incident. It was late afternoon, the light already slanting low, and I'd pushed farther than intended, lost in thought. I realized I'd been walking in silence for too long. No birds, no insects, even the wind stilled. That old familiar unease settled into my chest. I stopped. The forest did not resume its noise. Behind me, just beyond where the trail curved out of sight, I heard a footstep. One, then another. Slow, measured, matching the cadence I remembered too well. I did not turn around. I didn't need to. I left, I said quietly, unsure who or what I was speaking to. I don't belong to that life anymore. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but my own breathing, too fast, too loud. Then, from behind me, came a sound that wasn't quite a voice and wasn't quite anything else. It carried no words, but it carried meaning all the same. Acknowledgement, not forgiveness, not threat, recognition. When I finally found the courage to look, the trail was empty. But the forest felt different after that. Not hostile, not watchful, but settled. As if a question long left unanswered had finally been addressed. That was when I understood the truth I'd been avoiding. The cave was never just a place. It was a symbol made physical. A mouth where the forest spoke back. A reminder that beneath every managed trail and boundary line lies something older, something that does not recognize our authority unless we earn it. I had believed my badge gave me power, that my training made me immune, that knowledge was something you imposed on the land rather than something you received from it. The forest corrected me. I tell these stories now not as warnings meant to scare people away from the woods, Fear alone teaches nothing. I tell them because awe and humility are the only tools that have ever mattered out there. Because the land does not need us to conquer it or explain it. It needs us to listen. There are places you can walk for a lifetime and never truly see. And there are places, caves, ravines, stretches of old-growth pine, that see you the moment you arrive. They measure the weight of your intentions. They remember how you move through the world. If you ever find yourself deep in the forest and feel that quiet settle too suddenly, don't rush to fill it with noise or certainty. Stop. Breathe. Pay attention to what your instincts are trying to tell you before your mind talks them away. Because the pines are older than our maps, the caves are deeper than our reasons, and some stories are still whispered not because they are superstition, but because they are truths that learned how to survive by staying quiet. I learned that too late to save everyone, but not too late to remember my place.